We often think of forgiveness as a single moment, a bridge crossed once and then left behind. But for some, it is a long, quiet walk, taken every day for decades, built on the hope that even the deepest wounds can eventually be mended by a steady, loving hand. It is in these quiet, persistent acts of service that we find the true strength of the human spirit to overcome the shadows of the past. The Sunday sun always seemed to catch the peeling white paint of the Miller porch, casting long, gentle shadows that welcomed Arthur as he adjusted his tie. He stood there for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorbell, feeling the familiar weight of the small, ribbon-wrapped box of pastries he brought every week. To the neighbors, he was just a devoted old friend of the family. But to Arthur, every step onto this wood was a silent prayer for a peace he wasn't sure he deserved. When the door creaked open, Martha Miller greeted him with a smile that reached her tired eyes, pulling him into a hug that smelled of lavender and Sunday roast. She thanked him for the treats, her voice warm and steady, and led him into the hallway where the walls were lined with fading photographs of a life he had helped alter forever. Arthur followed her, his heart performing its usual rhythmic ache, a reminder of the secret he carried like a leaden coin in his pocket. They sat at the heavy oak table, the same spot where they had shared hundreds of meals, surrounded by the comfortable clutter of a home that had seen both great joy and immense sorrow. Arthur listened as Martha talked about her grandson's recent graduation, his eyes drifting to the framed picture of a young man in uniform resting on the sideboard. It was a face he saw every night when he closed his eyes, a face that remained forever young, while Arthur grew gray and weary. As the afternoon light shifted, Martha's husband, George, joined them, his hand resting briefly on Arthur's shoulder, in a gesture of masculine kinship that always made Arthur's throat tighten. They spoke of the weather and the local news, their conversation a bridge built over a chasm that only Arthur could see. Every laugh felt like a gift he hadn't earned, yet he clung to these moments as if they were the only things keeping him tethered to the world of the living. As the evening stretched on, Arthur spent the rest of the time helping George fix a leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, their tools clinking together in a rhythmic, productive harmony. He worked with a meticulous focus, pouring all his regret into the physical labor of maintaining the home of the people he had once considered his enemies. To George, Arthur was the brother he never had, the man who had appeared in their lives when their grief was at its sharpest and stayed until the edges were dull. Downstairs, the sound of the television hummed, a gentle backdrop to the quiet life they had constructed together over 30 long, transformative years. Arthur looked at his calloused hands, the same hands that had once held a rifle with a different kind of purpose, and he wondered how much good one man must do to balance the scales of a single terrible day. He knew that money and repairs could never replace what was lost, but he hoped that his presence offered a different kind of sustenance. Later, as they walked through the small backyard garden, Arthur pointed out the new buds on the rose bushes he had planted for Martha 5 years ago. He felt a fleeting sense of pride seeing them thrive, a living testament to the idea that something beautiful could grow from soil once hardened by neglect and sadness. Martha squeezed his arm, remarking on how he always knew exactly what the garden needed, unaware that he was simply trying to cultivate life, where he had once seen only its end. As he prepared to leave, the Millers stood together in the doorway, waving until his car turned the corner and disappeared from their sight. Arthur drove home in the gathering dusk, the silence of his own house waiting for him like an old, familiar friend who knew all his stories. He sat in his armchair, staring at the medals he kept hidden in a shoebox at the back of his closet, feeling the heavy pull of the upcoming anniversary. As the town was preparing for a grand celebration to honor the veterans of the community, Arthur had been chosen as the keynote speaker for his years of local service and quiet charity. He felt a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach, knowing that the spotlight would soon shine on a history he had worked so hard to bury beneath layers of kindness. He wondered if the pedestal the community had built for him would crumble the moment they saw the cracks in its foundation. He spent the following days wandering the local park, watching young families play and old couples walk hand in hand, feeling like a ghost moving through a world of light. He thought about the young man in the photograph, the one who never got to come home, and the family who had unknowingly invited his shadow into their most sacred spaces. The weight of the deception was becoming a physical burden, making it harder to breathe with every passing hour. One evening, Arthur sat at his desk, pen in hand, trying to write a speech that spoke of courage and honor, while his own soul felt like a landscape of ash. He realized that he couldn't stand before his friends and neighbors and accept their praise, while the truth remained a jagged stone in his heart. The heart flame of his life, the desire to bring warmth to others, was being smothered by the cold reality of a secret that had grown too large to contain. He visited the cemetery the next morning, standing before a row of white markers that stretched out like a silent army under the pale blue sky. And he spoke to the wind, whispering apologies that had been 30 years in the making, feeling the immense scale of the tragedy that war leaves in its wake. He knew that the time for hiding was coming to an end, and that the true test of his character would not be found in his service, but in his honesty. Returning to the Millers' home that Friday, he found them sitting on the porch, looking at an old photo album and laughing at memories of their son's childhood. The sound of their laughter felt like a knife, sharp and bright, cutting through the thin veil of his composure as he approached the steps. He took a deep breath, the scent of the roses he had planted filling his lungs, and realized that love built on a lie is a house built on sand. He joined them on the porch, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were walking through deep water. Martha patted the seat next to her, inviting him into the circle of their history, her voice filled with a mother's enduring pride for the son she still cherished. Arthur looked at the photos, the bicycle rides, the messy birthday cakes, the bright eyes of a boy who believed the world was kind, and felt the final defenses of his heart give way. As Arthur spoke, his words drifted gently into the quiet afternoon, like a soft breeze carrying something long held and tender. "I need to tell you how I really found you," he said, his voice a low tremor that seemed to shimmer in the stillness around them. George and Martha grew still, their hearts sensing the shift, as though the world they had shared for 3 whole decades had paused to listen. And as the sun dipped slowly below the horizon, brushing the sky with bruised purple and gold, Arthur stood there, preparing to tear down the world he had spent a lifetime building. He started from the beginning, describing the mud and the noise of a day that felt like a lifetime ago, a day when the lines between hero and villain were blurred by the smoke of battle. He told them about the young man who had crossed his path, a man who looked so much like the boy in their album, and the split-second decision that haunted every hour of his existence. As he spoke, the warmth of the evening seemed to drain away, leaving them cold, in the shadow of a truth that could no longer be ignored. The silence that followed his confession was heavier than any artillery fire he had ever experienced, a profound and hollow space where their shared history used to be. Martha's hand, which had been resting near his, pulled away slowly, a gesture of retreat that felt more painful than a physical blow. George looked away toward the darkening trees, his jaw set in a hard line that Arthur had never seen directed at him in all their years of friendship. Arthur sat with his head bowed, the words finally out in the open, feeling a strange and terrifying lightness as the burden shifted from his heart to the air between them. He didn't ask for forgiveness, knowing that such a request was an insult to the gravity of what he had taken and the complexity of his deception. He simply waited, a man stripped of his disguises, standing in the ruins of a 30-year penance that had suddenly been revealed as a masquerade. The stars began to blink into existence above them, indifferent to the human drama unfolding on the small white porch. Arthur stood up, his legs feeling weak and foreign, and walked toward his car without looking back, leaving the Millers alone with the ghost he had finally named. He drove away, the headlights cutting a path through a world that looked exactly the same, yet felt entirely different, knowing that the real story of the enemy at the table was only just beginning. The next morning, Arthur sat in his kitchen as the early light filtered through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stillness of his home. He stared at the phone, half expecting a call of fury or a message of finality, but the silence from the Miller house was a deafening roar that filled every corner of his mind. His breakfast sat untouched, the simple act of nourishment feeling like a luxury he no longer had the right to enjoy after shattering the peace of those he loved. He walked into his small living room where dozens of framed photos of his own life were displayed, each one quietly waiting for him, like familiar friends on a shelf. As he looked around, he realized just how many of those memories were intertwined with George and Martha. There were pictures of him at their anniversary parties, snapshots of him helping George paint the garage, and even a photo of him holding their grandson as an infant. Each image now felt like a piece of evidence in a trial he had already lost, a collection of moments stolen under a false identity. By midday, the news of Arthur's confession had begun to ripple through the tight-knit community, whispered over backyard fences and across supermarket aisles. He stepped out to get his mail and noticed his neighbor, a man he'd known for 20 years, looking away and hurrying inside his own house. The air in the neighborhood felt thick and heavy, as if the very atmosphere was reacting to the exposure of a secret that had lived in their midst for 3 decades. As Arthur decided to drive to the local VFW hall, he moved toward a place where he usually found a sense of belonging among fellow soldiers who understood the weight of the uniform. As he walked through the door, the usual clatter of pool cues and low, muttered jokes faded away, replaced by a cautious, questioning gaze from men who had once called him a brother. And in that quiet moment, he realized that his truth hadn't just affected the Millers. It had challenged the unspoken code of silence and heroism that held their small community together. He sat at the end of the bar, his hands wrapped around a glass of water, feeling the invisible wall that had suddenly been erected between him and the men he respected. One veteran, an old friend named Silas, walked over and sat down beside him, his face a mask of conflicted emotion as he looked at Arthur's weary profile. Silas didn't speak for a long time, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside, as they both grappled with the complexity of a man's life. "They're saying you've been living a lie, Art," Silas finally said, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the weight of a disappointment that cut deeper than any insult. Arthur nodded slowly, unable to look his friend in the eye, knowing that to these men, his actions in the war and his actions afterward were now inextricably linked. He explained that his service to the Millers was the only way he knew how to survive the memory, but Silas simply sighed and looked at the medals on the wall. As Arthur returned home, he found a small, handwritten note tucked into his screen door, the familiar script of Martha Miller, making his heart skip a beat with a mixture of hope and terror. He took it inside and sat at his desk, his hands trembling as he unfolded the paper, expecting a list of demands or a final goodbye. Instead, the note contained only 4 words: "We need to talk," followed by a time for the next evening, leaving Arthur suspended in a state of agonizing uncertainty. He spent the night pacing his hallway, the floorboards groaning under his feet as he replayed every conversation he'd ever had with the Millers in his head. He wondered if they saw his help as a genuine attempt at atonement, or as a calculated bribe to keep his conscience clear at their expense. The line between being a benefactor and a predator felt terrifyingly thin, and Arthur realized he might never truly know which one he had been in their eyes. As the following evening settled in, the walk up the Millers' driveway felt like a slow march toward a final judgment, the familiar scent of the roses now seeming to mock him with their beauty. And there was George, waiting on the porch, his face aged by a decade in just 48 hours, his eyes reflecting a deep, hollow exhaustion that made Arthur want to turn and run. They didn't exchange greetings. George simply gestured toward the door, and Arthur followed him into the house that had been his second home for 30 years. Martha was sitting at the kitchen table. The young man's photograph moved from the sideboard to the center of the wood, its presence a silent witness to the meeting. She looked at Arthur, her expression unreadable, and pushed a chair out for him with a mechanical movement that lacked her usual warmth. The kitchen, once a place of laughter and the smell of baking, now felt like a sterile room where the past was being meticulously dissected and examined. "Did you think we couldn't handle the truth?" Martha asked, her voice surprisingly steady, even though the redness around her eyes showed a night spent in tears. Arthur struggled to find words, realizing that his silence had been a form of control, a way to keep them in a reality that felt comfortable for him. He confessed that he was afraid of losing the only family he had left, but the admission felt selfish, even as the words left his dry, cracked lips. George leaned forward, his large hands clasped together on the table, and his gaze rested on Arthur with a quiet, steady intensity, as if he were holding his breath for the truth. He wanted Arthur to describe the man their son had been in those final moments, the parts the official military reports had gently brushed away. And so Arthur spoke, slowly, carefully, of the young man's bravery and the fear in his eyes, painting a picture that was both devastating and human, a small bridge forming between them through the shared ache of memory. As Arthur talked, the room seemed to soften slightly, the sharp edges of their anger giving way to the shared weight of a grief that had never truly left any of them. Martha reached out and touched the frame of the photograph, her fingers tracing the jawline of the son she would never see grow old. She told Arthur that while his help had been a blessing, the deception had robbed them of the chance to truly choose their path to healing. They sat in silence for nearly an hour, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant bark of a dog in the neighborhood. Arthur realized that he had spent 30 years trying to fix something that was inherently broken, failing to see that some things can only be carried, not repaired. He saw the struggle in their faces as they weighed the man who had mended their roof against the man who had ended their son's future. "We can't just go back to Sunday dinners, Arthur," George said finally, his voice heavy with a finality that felt like a door closing softly but firmly on an era of their lives. Arthur nodded, accepting the boundary as a necessary part of the truth he had unleashed, knowing that the enemy at the table could not simply be a friend again. He stood up to leave, feeling the immense distance between them even though they were only a few feet apart in the small, dim kitchen. As he reached the front door, Martha called out his name, stopping him in his tracks as he looked back one last time at the woman who had been like a mother to him. She told him that she didn't hate him, but that she needed time to find the man she thought she knew within the man he actually was. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a crack in the wall of silence, a tiny spark of hope in a landscape that had been scorched by honesty. Arthur walked to his car under a blanket of stars, the cool night air clearing the fog of the emotional confrontation that had drained his very soul. He knew the road ahead would be lonely and difficult as he worked to redefine his place in a town that now saw him as a complex, flawed human being. He drove away from the White House on the hill, realizing that true peace doesn't come from hiding our shadows, but from learning to live with them in the light. As the town's annual celebration arrived, a heavy, overcast sky seemed to mirror the somber mood in Arthur's heart. He stood backstage at the community center, his hands tucked into his pockets to hide their trembling as he listened to the muffled chatter of the crowd. He knew many were there specifically to see shift, gently, almost like a soft breeze, moving through quiet branches, from judgment to a profound shared reflection on the nature of mistakes and the courage it takes to own them. He saw men in the audience, men who carried their own unspoken burdens, leaning forward, their faces softening as Arthur articulated the quiet struggle of living with the past. And then, with a steady, humble warmth, he told the community that he didn't want their praise for his charity. No, he simply hoped for their understanding of his journey toward a truth that set everyone free. He looked directly at George and Martha, his eyes misting over as he thanked them for the 3 decades of grace they had unknowingly extended to a man who had been their enemy. He told them that the heart flame of their home had been the only light that guided him out of the darkness of his own regret. When he finished, he didn't wait for applause. He simply stepped down from the stage, feeling a profound sense of closure that no medal or trophy could ever provide. In the hallway afterward, Arthur found himself surrounded not by critics, but by people who wanted to share their own stories of hidden regrets and the search for peace. And as he listened, he realized something gentle and true, that by exposing his own shadow, he had given others permission to step out of theirs, creating a community of shared vulnerability rather than curated perfection. It wasn't the heroic exit he had once imagined, but it was a deeply human one that felt more authentic than any lie he had ever lived. He walked out into the cool afternoon air, the clouds finally breaking to let a few stray beams of sunlight touch the damp pavement. He saw Silas waiting by his car, the old veteran giving him a simple, firm nod of respect that told Arthur their brotherhood had survived the storm of the truth. They stood together in silence for a moment, 2 men who had seen the worst of the world and were still trying to find the best in themselves. A soft footfall on the gravel made Arthur turn, and he found Martha Miller standing a few feet away, her coat wrapped tightly against the breeze. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with a gaze that held both the memory of her son and the reality of the man standing before her. She reached out and placed a small knitted scarf into his hands, a project she had started months ago, and told him that the garden would need pruning again in a few weeks. The gesture was small, but to Arthur it was a bridge being rebuilt, stone by stone, on the firm foundation of the truth. He understood that things would never be the same, but perhaps they could be something different, something more honest, and something more resilient than before. He watched her walk back to George, who was waiting by their old truck, and he felt a gentle, rising surge of hope. A hope that whispered that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, but about moving forward. Together. As Arthur drove home that evening, the familiar route felt new and vibrant under the changing light of the sunset. When he reached his house, he went to his closet and took out the shoebox of medals, looking at them one last time before gently tucking them away, no longer needing them to define his worth or his history. Then he sat on his porch, watching the stars emerge, and realized that for the first time in 30 years, he wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. He spent the next Sunday morning in his own garden, the soil beneath his fingernails feeling like a connection to the earth and the cycle of life that continues despite human failings. He thought about the young man in the photograph and realized that the best way to honor his memory was to live a life of radical honesty and quiet, genuine kindness. The secret was gone, and in its place was a quiet, steady peace that felt like a homecoming he had traveled a lifetime to reach. The story of the veteran who returned his medals and the family who chose to see his heart became a legend in the town, a gentle reminder that redemption is a journey, not a destination. Arthur continued to visit the Millers, not as a guardian angel or a hidden enemy, but simply as a man who was forgiven for his humanity. They sat at the table together, the ghost finally laid to rest, finding that even in the aftermath of a great storm, the flame of the heart can still burn bright and true. True forgiveness doesn't require us to erase the past, but it asks us to build a future where the truth is finally allowed to breathe. When we stop hiding our scars, we discover that they are not marks of shame, but maps that lead us back to the people we were always meant to be.